Direct persons. Okay, so we are reading Notes from Underground, or Notes from the Underground. That glare, there it is, by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Love this man's work so far. On chapter 3, so with people who know how to revenge themselves and to stand up for themselves in general, how is it done? Why, when they're possessed, let us suppose, by the feeling of revenge, then for the time there is nothing else but that feeling left in their whole being? Yeah, it sounds pretty accurate. I mean, when you're consumed by revenge, you're literally consumed. And then it almost seems like there's absolutely nothing else out there but to seek and follow through on your revenge. Such a gentleman simply dashes straight for his object like an infuriated bull with its horns down and nothing but a wall to stop him. By the way, facing the wall, such gentlemen, that is the direct persons and men of action, are genuinely nonplussed. Okay, so yeah, they dash straight for the object like an infuriated bull, yep, and nothing but a wall will stop him. Okay, so essentially an immovable object and an unstoppable force. And men of action are genuinely facing the wall, they're genuinely nonplussed. So that, what does that mean? I mean, on the surface, it's like they just don't like the wall being there. But as opposed to considering the wall an obstacle maybe that they can get through some way, they're just like, forget this wall, I wish it wasn't here, I need to get through it. So for them, a wall is not an evasion. As for us people who think and consequently do nothing, it is not an excuse for turning aside, an excuse for which we are always very glad, though we scarcely believe in it ourselves as a rule. Okay, so there we go. So for them, a wall is not an evasion. So I guess it's not an excuse. As for us people who think and consequently do nothing. So aside from men of action, everyone else think about it and then see the wall and do nothing. Then a wall is not Yeah, okay, for the men of action, it is not an excuse for turning aside, an excuse for which we're always very glad, though we scarcely believe in it ourselves as a rule. So these men of action don't see it as an excuse, where most people would. And then the most people are usually glad to get the excuse. No, they're nonplussed in all sincerity. The wall has for them something tranquilizing, morally soothing. Final, maybe even something mysterious, but of the wall later. Okay. Yipes. Okay, so no, they're nonplussed in all sincerity. So they're actually genuinely not happy about it, as opposed to most people who are happy to have the excuse to just evade it. So I guess this is a commentary on personalities and how most people will usually make excuses when they see an obstacle, but people of action, or men of action as he's referring to here, they're not happy that it's there, the wall, but don't see it as an excuse to evade. The wall has for them something tranquilizing, morally soothing, final, maybe even something mysterious. Morally soothing. Interesting. Well, such a direct person I regard as the real normal man, as his tender mother nature wished to see him when she graciously brought him into being on the earth. Okay. So the narrator here feels like that this person who does not see the wall as an obstacle, as a direct person, and refers to them as the real normal man, as Mother Nature wished to see him. Okay, so that's how the narrator here feels that we all should be, and how Mother Nature intended. I envy such a man till I am green in the face. He is stupid. I am not disputing that, but perhaps the normal man should be stupid. How do you know? Perhaps it is very beautiful, in fact, and I am the more persuaded of that suspicion, if one can call it so, by the fact that if you take, for instance, the antithesis of the normal man, that is the man of acute consciousness, who has come, of course, not out of the lap of nature, but out of retort. This is almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect this too. This retort-made man is sometimes so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis that with all his exaggerated consciousness, he genuinely thinks of himself as a mouse and not a man. Okay, this is pretty dense. So, okay, the narrator thinks that that real man is stupid. But perhaps the normal man should be stupid. Perhaps it is very beautiful, in fact. And he's more persuaded. If one can call it so by the fact that if you take, for instance, the antithesis of the normal man, the man of acute consciousness, not out of the lap of nature, but out of a retort. So a retort to nature. So I think that's why he kind of refers to it almost as a mysticism, because nature's there, it's sort of set, it works the way it does. You can see it, touch it, understand how it works. So a retort to that. Would be things that aren't tangible, things that you can't necessarily see or understand how they work. So that's the mysticism that he refers to. This retort-made man, so the mystical man, is sometimes so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis that with all his exaggerated consciousness, he genuinely thinks of himself as a mouse and not a man. It may be an acutely conscious mouse, yet it is a mouse, while the other is a man, and therefore, etc., etc. And the worst of it is, he himself, his very own self, looks on himself as a mouse. No one asks him to do so, and that is an important point. Okay, so what he's saying here, it seems, is that the retort-made man, so the mystical man, is so conscious of things that he considers himself a mouse in comparison to the normal man. So why would that be? So I think what he's trying to say here is the more conscious you are, the weaker you feel. Kind of the less you feel. And I mean, you're humbled. The more conscious you are of everything, presumably you are humbled by that, made to feel and look so small that how could you not feel like a mouse? Whereas the normal man is not conscious of these things and just sort of almost has like a tunnel vision and just kind of runs into and through walls. The worst of it is he himself, his very own self, looks on himself as a mouse. No one asks him to do so, and that is an important point. That's almost saying, I think, that with greater consciousness, inherently you're already going to look at yourself as being smaller without anyone else causing that. And that kind of along the lines of what I was saying, it's like the more consciousness you have, the more humble you are, the smaller you feel. Now, this narrator is presuming that that's a bad thing. Okay, so let's take some notes here. So, with greater consciousness, comes a feeling of smallness, like a mouse. And then I think it's important point of what he's saying is that it's almost self-imposed. It doesn't have to be, it's not caused by anyone else. It's self-imposed. Now, let us look at this mouse in action. It is inherent in greater consciousness. Okay, now let us look at this mouse in action. Let us suppose, for instance, that it feels insulted too, and it almost always does feel insulted, and wants to revenge itself. There may even be a greater accumulation of spite in it than in l'homme de la nature et de la vérité. So, accumulation of spite in it than in the man of nature and of truth. Pretty sure that's what that means. Someone wants to revenge itself too. There may even be a greater accumulation of spite in it. Okay, so he's saying in this mystery or mystic man, there might actually be more spite in it than the other man, the man of nature, the man of verite. Verite is life, or is it truth? Truth, okay. And a man of truth. The base and nasty desire to vent that spite on its assailant rankles perhaps even more nastily in it than, once again, the man of nature and truth. For through his innate stupidity, the latter looks upon his revenge as justice pure and simple, while in consequence of his acute consciousness, the mouse does not believe in the justice of it. To come at last to the deed itself, to the very act of revenge. Interesting. So, for through his innate stupidity, the latter looks upon his revenge as justice pure and simple, while in consequence of his acute consciousness, the mouse does not believe in the justice of it. So what I get from that is kind of what I said before, where the man of nature and truth, he only sees the revenge and getting justice. Nothing else comes to mind, nothing holding him back. Whereas the conscious man, he might see the revenge and feel the revenge, but due to the greater consciousness, there are other factors there that need to be considered. He doesn't only see the justice. He maybe sees the justice, but then maybe the consequences of the justice, whether it's criminal or physical harm or the moral side of it. So that's an example of, I guess, the burden that comes with greater consciousness is you consider all those other things that cause maybe a dissonance. Whereas the man of nature and truth, according to Dostoevsky, doesn't think of any of those things. He's not conscious of any of those things. He just does it. To come at last to the deed itself, to the very act of revenge. Apart from the one fundamental nastiness the luckless mouse succeeds in creating around it, so many other nastinesses in the form of doubts and questions. Okay, so that's kind of what I was saying. All those other things come into play. Adds to the one question so many unsettled questions that there inevitably works up around it a sort of fatal brew, a stinking mess made up of its doubts, emotions, and of the contempt spat upon it by the direct men of action who stand solemnly about it as judges and arbitrators, laughing at it till their healthy sides ache. Okay. So, yeah. So with all those with the greater consciousness comes all these questions and doubts and feelings that cause, in his words, a fatal brew. So a lot of dissonance, a stinking mess. And then the men of truth or men of nature see that and then spit upon it and laugh at it. And then laugh at it till their healthy sides ache. Of course, the only thing left for it is to dismiss all that with a wave of its paw, and with a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even itself believe. All that with a wave of its paw, and with a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even itself believe. Creep ignominiously. Oh my gosh. Ignominiously. There we go. Ignominiously. That's a new one. Okay. We're going to take that down as a new word. Ignominiously. Or ignominious, I guess. Let's see.
Ignominious.
Ignominious. Okay, I had the pronunciation correct. Deserving or causing public disgrace or shame. Deserving or causing public disgrace or okay, so let's read that now that we know the word. Of course, the only thing left for it is to dismiss all that with a wave of its paw, and with a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even itself believe. That is a little obscure to me. With a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even itself believe. So this is the mouse. So with an assumed contempt, the mouse doesn't even in itself believe. Creep ignominiously into its mouse hole. There in its nasty, stinking underground home are insulted, crushed, and ridiculed mouse promptly becomes absorbed in cold, malignant, and above all, everlasting spite. Okay. For 40 years together, it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most ignominious details, and every time will add of itself details still more ignominious, spitefully teasing and tormenting itself with its own imagination. So, this is obviously an extreme. So this mouse is so conscious of its own emotions, of its environment, of its questions, of its doubts, that it's so overwhelming, it becomes absorbed in cold, malignant, and above all, everlasting spite. So I guess what he's saying is the product of this is that a spite develops. You're so conscious that everything looks terrible, everything looks like there's no way out, nothing, no point to it, and that level of consciousness alone is extremely difficult to shoulder, and it's a huge burden. Teasing and tormenting itself with its own imagination. Yeah, so there's so many facets, so many things that its imagination is just constantly stimulated, constantly there, constantly coming up with new and more frightening, more awful outcomes and thoughts and doubts and emotions. It will itself be ashamed of its imaginings, but yet it will recall it all, and it will go over and over every detail. Okay, so there's that idea of it being an extreme burden. It will invent unheard of things against itself, pretending that those things might happen, and will forgive nothing. Wow. Maybe it will begin to revenge itself too, but, as it were, piecemeal, in trivial ways, from behind the stove, incognito, without believing either in its own right to vengeance or in the success of its revenge, knowing that from all its efforts at revenge, it will suffer 100 times more than he on whom it revenges itself, while he, I dare say, will not even scratch himself. Wow. That's insane. So there's that torment. Go over and over every detail. It will invent unheard of things against itself. So creating more and more and more dissonance, pretending that those things might happen, and will forgive nothing. So constant conflict, constant doubt. Maybe it will begin to revenge itself too. This sentence, my gosh, the commas. Maybe it will begin to revenge itself, comma, too, comma, but, comma, as it were, comma, piecemeal, comma, in trivial ways, comma, from behind the stove, incognito. So I think what he's saying here is in very small, atomized, or in very individual, subtle ways, from behind the stove. I would guess that would mean kind of almost hidden. Meaning. Okay, it doesn't look like there's anything formal. What I read from it is, it's just something that's hidden that might come out, especially with other words here and phrases that are around it. Incognito, something you don't see or recognize. So it'll revenge itself in very subtle and small ways, small pieces that eventually will accumulate, without believing either in its own right to vengeance or in the success of its revenge. So you have all of this, and it knows its revenge, it wants its revenge, but then all those other factors are considered where it doesn't actually believe in its revenge. It doesn't believe that it can actually succeed in it, that it should succeed in it, and then it again is worried about all the other outcomes that could come from it. So once again, it's just this constant dissonance. Knowing that from all its efforts at revenge, it will suffer 100 times more than he on whom it revenges itself, while he, I dare say, will not even scratch himself. On its deathbed, it will recall it all over again, with interest accumulated over all the years. Holy! This is deep. I think I'm grasping it though. So you kind of have the man of nature, and then you have what the narrator calls the mouse. This man of nature, this man of truth, has very little consciousness, and, metaphorically, sees a wall and won't see it as a reason to run from something or evade. He just kind of sees the wall, runs into it or runs through it, and isn't conscious of the consequences of that. And in this example, he's using revenge. So the man of truth and of nature will just pursue the revenge completely. And then there's the mouse, as the narrator calls it, who has much greater consciousness and is conscious of more in general, but because of that very consciousness is weak and questions himself or herself, questions the revenge, torments themselves with this revenge, and this greater consciousness inherently causes them to crawl inward and bury themselves and torment themselves, because there's constant doubt, constant questions, constant uncertainties, constant emotion, questions its beliefs. So I think on a general level here, what it's saying about, what the narrator's saying about the personality, maybe from a psychological standpoint, is, you know, there are people that are just less conscious of things, whether by choice or not. I mean, and I think I would lean toward that they don't actually choose to be that way. They're just less conscious of things. They'll have an easier time. Whereas there are those who are very conscious, and that's not necessarily by choice, and choose to just, not, as I say that, not choose to, but without their control, just are conscious of more things, and within their mind, it then creates a lot of dissonance, stimulates their imagination in a lot of different ways, creates more emotions, creates more questions, problems. And if it's not controlled or maintained or dealt with, it can probably lead them into a very dark place. Interesting. All right, so we'll get to chapter 4, kind of like a page and a half left. But it is just in that cold, abominable half despair, half belief, in that conscious burying oneself alive for grief in the underworld for 40 years, in that acutely recognized and yet partly doubtful hopelessness of one's position, in that hell of unsatisfied desires turned inward, in that fever of oscillations, of resolutions determined forever and repented of again a minute later, that the savor of that strange enjoyment of which I have spoken lies. Okay, so saying within all of that dissonance, within all that emotion, imagination, is that savor of that strange enjoyment of which I've spoken. It's where that lies. So there's a strange enjoyment in that. It is so subtle, so difficult of analysis, that persons who are a little limited, or even simply persons of strong nerves, will not understand a single atom of it. Possibly, you will add on your own account with a grin. People will not understand it either who have never received a slap in the face. And in that way you will politely hint to me that I, too, perhaps have had the experience of a slap in the face in my life, and so I speak as one who knows. So maybe learning the hard way. Without learning the hard way, you'll never really know. I bet you're thinking that, but set your minds at rest, gentlemen. I have not received a slap in the face, though it is absolutely a matter of indifference to me what you may think about it. Possibly I even regret, myself, that I have given so few slaps in the face during my life. But enough, not another word on that subject of such extreme interest to you. Okay, so a little bit earlier he referred to this strange enjoyment within what he really makes sound awful and horrible and does it in sort of a rant, very verbose and pedantic. Just making sure that I'm using pedantic correctly. Come on. Definitely not typing correctly. Over-exacting perfectionist. Okay. It's probably not pedantic. It's loquacious. Is probably a better word. Verbose, loquacious. But it is preachy in a way, so maybe pedantic works. Anywho, I will continue calmly concerning persons with strong nerves who do not understand a certain refinement of enjoyment. Though in certain circumstances these gentlemen bellow their loudest like bulls. Though this, let us suppose, does them the greatest credit. Yet, as I have said already, confronted with the impossible, they subside at once. The impossible means the stone wall. What stone wall? Why, of course, the laws of nature, the deductions of natural science, mathematics. Okay, so that's the wall that he was referring to. So let me just read it. I will continue calmly concerning persons with strong nerves who do not understand a certain refinement of enjoyment. Okay, so he wants to appeal to not the mouse, but the man of nature, as he refers to. Though in certain circumstances these gentlemen bellow their loudest like bulls. Though this, let us suppose, does them the greatest credit. Yet, as I have said already, confronted with the impossible, they subside at once. Okay, so they bellow, maybe they're pounding on their chest, they're kind of that, personifying strength. But even with that strength, they run into that wall. And according to Dostoevsky, that wall is nature, things that just absolutely cannot be overcome by man. As soon as they prove to you, for instance, that you are descended from a monkey, then it is no use scowling, accept it for a fact. When they prove to you that in reality one drop of your own fat must be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow creatures, and that this conclusion is the final solution of all so-called virtues and duties and all such prejudices and fancies, then you have just to accept it. There's no help for it, for twice two is the law of mathematics. Just try refuting it. As soon as they prove to you, for instance, that you're descended from a monkey, then it is no use scowling, accept it for a fact. When they prove to you that in reality one drop of your own fat must be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow creatures, and that this conclusion is the final solution of all so-called virtues and duties, and all such prejudices and fancies, then you have to just accept it. There's no help for it. For twice two is the law of mathematics. Okay, so ultimately, it's every man for themselves. No one else matters. So all these virtues and duties and prejudices and fancies don't matter. They just have to accept it, and there's no help for it, for twice 2 is the law of mathematics. So context, I think, is a little important here from what I'm getting from this. This person, this narrator that Dostoevsky's portraying, is very, very bitter. Kind of in this place where nothing matters. And I think by, through this man's ramblings, he's trying to tell us where that type of thinking leads. Upon my word, they will shout at you, it is no use protesting. It is a case of twice 2 makes 4. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. Can't do anything about it, sorry. No matter what you do or think, it doesn't matter. Nature does not ask your permission. She has nothing to do with your wishes, and whether you like her laws or dislike them, you are bound to accept her as she is, and consequently all her conclusions. A wall, you see, is a wall, and so on and so on. Merciful heavens, but what do I care for the laws of nature and arithmetic, when for some reason I dislike those laws and the fact that twice 2 makes 4? Of course I cannot break through the wall by battering my head against it if I really have not the strength to knock it down, but I'm not going to be reconciled to it simply because it is a stone wall and I have not the strength. Okay, so it just sounds like this person is extremely bitter about the fact that they're unable to change nature, to affect it, that there's nothing they can do about it, and it makes, even though they know that, it makes them very bitter. And he's kind of saying, well, even though I know it's a wall and I can't do anything about it, I'm not going to be reconciled to it. As though such a stone wall really were a consolation, and really did contain some word of conciliation, simply because it is as true as twice 2 makes 4. So that reconciliation or conciliation is understanding that. It's like, okay, it's a wall, I can't do anything about it. I think he's kind of saying that there's some enjoyment in that. Oh, absurdity of absurdities, how much better it is to understand it all, to recognize it all the impossibilities in the stone wall. Not to be reconciled to one of these impossibilities in stone walls if it disgusts you to be reconciled to it, by the way of the most inevitable logical combinations to reach the most revolting conclusions on the everlasting theme, that even for the stone wall you are yourself somehow to blame, though again it is as clear as day you are not to blame in the least, and therefore grinding your teeth in silent impotence to sink into luxurious inertia, brooding on the fact that there is no one even for you to feel vindictive against, that you have not and perhaps never will have an object for your spite, that it is sleight of hand, a bit of juggling, a card sharper's trick, that it is simply a mess, not knowing what and no knowing who. But in spite of all these uncertainties and jugglings, still there is an ache in you, and the more you do not know, the worse the ache. Oh my gosh. Now that's a sentence. How much better it is to understand it all, to recognize it all the impossibilities and the stone wall. So he's saying kind of how absurd is that? Not to be reconciled to one of those impossibilities and stone walls if it disgusts you to be reconciled to it. By the way of the most inevitable, logical combinations to reach the most revolting conclusions on the everlasting theme. That even for the stone wall you are yourself somehow to blame. Okay, so it's like there's this theme, I guess, in life where there's this stone wall, nature, you blame yourself for those inevitabilities, though again it is clear as day you are not to blame in the least, and therefore grinding your teeth in silent impotence to sink into luxurious inertia. So the silent impotence, so it's sort of this, I guess, the daily feeling, this constant feeling of a weakness to nature, a helplessness to it. And therefore grinding your teeth in silent impotence to sink into luxurious inertia, brooding on the fact that there's no one even for you to feel vindictive against. So it's like you can't blame anyone for it, even though you feel horrible about it. That you have not, and perhaps will never have, an object for your spite. That it is a sleight of hand, a bit of juggling, a card sharper's trick. That it is simply a mess, no knowing what and no knowing who. But in spite of all these uncertainties and jugglings, still there is an ache in you, and the more you do not know, the worse the ache. Okay, you can't blame anyone. You don't have an object for your spite, that it's all a trick, it's a mess, no knowing what and no knowing who, or what or who did it, or put you in this position. But in spite of all these uncertainties and jugglings, still there's an ache in you, and the more you do not know, the worse the ache. The more you do not know, the worse the ache. Wow. Okay, so it's sort of this resentment against nature and our impotence toward nature and our inability to do nothing. 2 + 2 is 4. You can't do anything about it, even though you may resent that. And because of that, sort of live with this hum, this ache, and you can't blame anyone for it. And the more you do not know, the worse the aches. That's what's kind of throwing me off here. Because he was implying earlier that the greater the consciousness, the more you know, the worse it is. Still there's an ache in you, and the more you do not know now, the worse the ache. Maybe I just don't quite understand it. If you have been vindictive against it, you have not have an object for spite that is a sleight of hand. Or I guess maybe it has nothing to do with that. Maybe it's just knowing I'll have to think on that one. Anyway, that was chapter 3. Pretty deep stuff here. So this narrator seems just like a man who's in a really dark place. And Dostoevsky seems to be, through his diary or memoirs or journal here, showing where a person can end up if they maintain sort of a similar mindset or attitude as this person. The narrator doesn't really say, just sort of, I think, a civil servant or a retired civil servant. Cool. Well, that was chapter 3. Once again, notes from the underground. By Fyodor Dostoevsky. I love this type of stuff. I've only read Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and this is my third Dostoevsky book, but I'm loving his work so far. And I love this type of material. Either fiction with a lot of psychological aspects or deep meaning and themes, or nonfiction, psychological, philosophical work, historical. I love history too. So anyway, just trying something out here with this, reading this type of stuff and trying to unpack it. Verbalizing it like this helps me understand it, and then hopefully those who are watching or listening are interested in this type of material as well. I think this type of stuff, this book, his work, are just so amazing, and I think people should read it. I think people should read more in general, but anywho, okay. All right. Word of the stream, unction, which means the action of anointing someone with oil or ointment as a religious rite or as a symbol of investiture as a monarch. This one came from Madame Bovary, which I finished the other day, and it was good, although I don't think I did it justice. Finding the material that I'm reading now is hard to read before I sleep, so I usually read in bed. And this is also why I'm doing this kind of thing, where I'm reading attentively and verbalizing it, because it really helps me understand it better. But when you're just groggy and slowly falling asleep, it's tougher. And I think with a lot of these books, they demand your attention, and I think you can get a lot more out of them if you don't read passively. And that's what I did probably, honestly, for 3/4 of Madame Bovary, because the final quarter of the book I loved. It's just such a finely written book. It's unbelievable. So I don't think I gave it justice or did it justice. I might have to revisit it at some point, but we'll see. Played some Magic earlier today, and kind of sort of like a league, kind of sort of. Not kind of sort of, it was a league. Went 1-3, unfortunately, but played, it was actually my first time playing Red-Green Scapeshift. So I had no expectations. I just wanted to go in and learn and get some games on it. And that's what we did. Okay, so no. And then, of course, on screen, have the latest runs. The PB, personal best 3-kilometer speed run, and then a personal best 10K. So doing really well, have a lot of momentum. Tomorrow I plan on, anyway, doing the 30K run. Sundays are great for running. I don't know what it is about them, but they're great for running, although I think I'll be hurting quite a bit after that. but I know I have to slow my pace. Let me just bring up the stats here. Because when I attempted a very long run last time, I went too quickly. My pace was too fast and I kind of just broke down at 23 kilometers. Actually, it was earlier than that. It was about 22, 21 and a half. I hit a personal best half marathon, but I paid the price. So I think for this 30K run, where are we? 23. That average pace was 5:53, which in looking back was too fast for me. And I mean, at that point too, I've improved, but I'll probably look to go an average pace of 6 minutes and 30 seconds, maybe 6:45 per kilometer. Because at this point, I haven't run that distance before. So I just want to run it. I want to know that, okay, I can do it. And then I'll have a baseline pace that I can work with and then improve from there. But right now, this is uncharted territory, so I just want to make sure that I can do it. And I believe I can do it. And it's not even that, it's just I want to have it under my belt so I can get a picture of how I did it and then work from there. Cadence will be much lower, probably hover around between 165 and 170, maybe even less actually, probably 160 to 165, which is fine. I mean, it's my speed runs where I really put more emphasis on that kind of thing. I can't lose sight of the fact that I need to just finish this marathon. There's a lot of time for speed runs and that kind of thing. But the goal right now is to just finish a marathon. So I can't lose sight of that. And that's not to say the speed runs and everything I've done will not help me get there, but ultimately I need to do the best I can to run the longer distances. And I need to make sure that I take electrolytes and hydration into account. Because I didn't do that last time either, and it might have hurt me. I don't know exactly. Hmm.